Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Amir Wadi, and this is for Pre-Lab 7 Ethics. I am going to be analyzing case study 19 Tax 6 from the year 2019 off the nspe.org site for licensure out of state. And to start with the facts of this case, Engineer A is licensed in State A, is retained by an attorney in the state to evaluate a large piece of capital equipment that failed in an industrial plant located there. There's a pending legal action before the state's courts. Following the equipment failure, the owner moved the equipment to its warehouse in State B. Engineer A is not licensed in State B. The question was, would it be ethical for the Engineer A, who's not licensed in State B, to inspect equipment in State B? So, following the NCEES publication 24.15, Rules of Professional Conduct, the three rules listed out state that
students use built-in tutorials to help familiarize themselves with the tools available.
Lists that a licensee's obligation to the public, right? A licensee's obligation to an employer and client, and a licensee's obligation to other licensees. So in this case, let's start with the first one. A licensee's obligation to the public. Obviously, the facts state that a piece of equipment that was used in State A needed to be inspected by Engineer A. But the owner of that equipment moved that equipment to State B. So is it ethical for now this engineer in State A to inspect that piece of equipment in State B? If that equipment posed a threat to the safety, health, and welfare of the public, ethically, what that engineer would be doing would be correct. However, because it is outside of his current jurisdiction, that licensee has, or that engineer has, a obligation to cooperate with the licensee of State B, and he should not attempt to misrepresent himself or his associates, right, and or to exaggerate the degree of responsibility, right, because now the complexity of this assignment has become that there is a legal action against the owner of the equipment who moved that equipment to State B. So this kind of made it almost not impossible, but it made it more difficult for Engineer A to be able to inspect that equipment. And then there's also the obligation to the employer and the client, right? So it's the engineer's obligation to the attorney, right? Which is his client. It's he has to fulfill their requirements, right? But he shouldn't take on the assignment because he is not qualified to perform those services in State B. He's only qualified to perform those services in State A. But that doesn't mean that he himself cannot retain the services of another engineer in State B to help out. Looking through the discussions, right, the engineer licensure encompasses the fundamental issues of the ethical obligation to comply with state engineering licensure laws and regulations, as well as a demonstration of professional competency, right? So Engineer A, a professional engineer with expertise, right, he should know that he can only retain his expertise in State A. Unless he is properly licensed in State B or State B has some sort of licensure agreement with State A, ethically he cannot perform those kinds of duties, and it would go against his intent to provide his services if he doesn't inform his employer / client as to what is going on. The overall conclusion was that Engineer A has an ethical obligation to review the definition of practices of engineering in State B or become licensed in State B if the activities Engineer A will be performing require a license, which in this case they do. And so from an ethical standpoint, he needs to get licensed. Engineer A would need to be licensed in State B to perform engineering services in State B before being retained. And I would advise that he would have to inform his client, the attorney's office that retained his services, that he does not meet those qualifications at the moment, but should attempt to meet those qualifications, or assist them in finding another engineering company or associate licensed within State B to perform those services.